It's a pleasure to be with you this second week. I trust that the majority of you were with us last week as well. And today, as Ari prepares the resource sheet that I prepared for this session, I'll say we're going to talk about, as the title suggests, an inquiry as to what is it exactly that we are crying about or mourning for when we talk about Tish'aa B'Av as an arch date for Jewish calamity, as it were. And indeed, for the most part, when we talk about Tish'aa B'Av, the ninth day of Av, Tish'aa B'Av is usually associated in people's popular imagination and even understanding as the day of the destruction of the temples of Jerusalem, both the first and second. But in fact, that designation is highly superficial. And as a matter of fact, Tish'aa B'Av stands for something that is indeed far more profound in terms of the trajectory of the Jewish world and the Jewish world in which we live today. So in order to unpack Tish'aa B'Av more properly, today's session is going to be a bird's eye view, a contextualized look at what brought about Tish'aa B'Av and how Tish'aa B'Av actually commemorates not a destruction of a building or an institution, but rather a dramatic and transformative change in the very foundation and trajectory of the Jewish world. And when I say a transformative change, I'm talking about a paradigm shift, as this series of lectures is called, a paradigm shift from one model of Jewish life to another model of Jewish life, namely a transformation from the biblical model of antiquity to the rabbinic model in the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple, which of course is one of the temples that Tish'aa B'Av commemorates. So in order for us to start, we need to start at the beginning, and that is, of course, the first model, which is the biblical model. And when we talk about the biblical model, in general, we see, if we follow the biblical narrative, we see that the relationship between the God of Israel and the people of Israel is negotiated through a number of factors, be they events, people, institutions, or landscapes, which act as what I shall call here axis mundi, the axis of the world, or in other words, people or institutions, as we shall see, who actually, or events that actually negotiate between divine governance, the divine intervention, and the human arena, the Jewish people's lives. And if we look at the biblical model, we see that there are a number of elements that play that role of axis mundi. Number one is, of course, what we come to know in the biblical model as miracles. Miracles are acts of divinity or divine assistance, which demonstrate to human beings that there is a divine governance, a divine sanctioning of a human act or of an individual that shows that God presides over and agrees with whatever it is that happens on earth in that context. So for example, when we look at Jeremiah, and I'm bringing just Few examples for each one, because otherwise we would be here for the whole night. If you look at Jeremiah, the way Jeremiah describes God to his people, he says, this is the God who set signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, even unto this day, and in Israel and among other men, and made you a name as at this day, you meaning the people of Israel. So miracles are one axis mundi that negotiates between divinity and humanity. The second is prophecy. So here's an example. In Samuel, we read, and Samuel grew and the Lord was with him. Here is again divine intervention and divine sanctioning, and did let none of his words fall to the ground. And all of Israel, from Dan even to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord. Now, a word or two about prophets, because prophecy and prophets are many a time fall under misperception by popular imagination. Unlike popular belief, the prophets of Israel are not people who know the future. They are not crystal ball handlers, they are not soothsayers, but rather, if you want to imagine a prophet, to give a kind of an image of a prophet, you will end up with a face that looks a little bit crooked, like something rendered by Picasso. If you know Picasso's faces, they are crooked and somewhat non-realistic. A prophet is a person, a man or a woman. We have male prophets, we have female prophetess. Is a person who has one eye. Imagine one eye looking at divinity, another eye looking at mankind, at humankind, and a mouth that now articulates the gap or the disparity between the left eye and the right eye. In other words, a prophet is an individual who exists within the disparity between the divine desire for humanity and human behavior. To put it bluntly, when a prophet appears before the people, it's an oh crap moment. You will never find a prophet who comes to the Israelites and say, hi, my name is Jeremiah. God sent me and I just came here to tell you that you guys are great. You're doing a fantastic job. All the power to you. See you later. There isn't such a prophet. A prophet always comes when the trajectory of humanity deviates from the envisioned divine charge. What God wants and what humanity does are two different things. A prophet enters the scene, and a prophet is someone who receives that understanding of the divine charge through a prophetic knowledge. So he or she too are negotiators, axis mundi, between the divine and the divine will and human conduct. That is why the prime word in prophetic discourse in the Bible is return, repent. In other words, a prophet sees a plausible outcome of human behavior and is brought into the picture in order to change this envisioned trajectory of mankind and have it return to divinity. This is why, for example, one of the common names that prophets give to the Israelites, to the people of Israel, are, and I'm sure it's a term that you've heard before, stiff-necked nation. And the reason they call them a stiff-necked nation, meaning it's a people with a stiff neck, it's not just to say that they are stubborn, but it's actually the prophet now articulates what God sees. And when people draw away from divinity, turn their back to God, as it were, what God sees through the words of the prophet is the back of their necks. And he says to them, That's what I see. You're a stiff-necked people. Return. Look at me again. Meet me eye to eye so we can continue that covenant between us that we have signed and agreed upon all the way through the fathers and the mothers and through the Torah. The third axis mundi are the priests and, of course, the temple. Now here, I'll ask you a question without even reading this source. If I told you about the high priest, and those of you can imagine the high priest of the temple, most of you will probably and rightfully say that the 12 precious stones, that each of which now describes one tribe of Israel and are part of the Kohen Gadol, part of the high priest's attire, are positioned on his chest, right? They're called chest plate, on his chest. But actually, if you read carefully, you'll see a different picture, that the chest is only part of the picture. Look at what Exodus 28 says to us. And bring down near unto you Aaron thy brother. Aaron is, of course, the brother of Moses, and his sons with him, from among the children of Israel, that they may minister unto me in the priest's office, even Arnon, Nadav, Abihu, Elazar, and Itamar, Aaron's sons. And thou shalt take 2 onyx stones, engrave on them the names of the children of Israel, 6 of their names on one stone, and the names of the 6 that remain on the other stone, according to their birth. Now look at that. And thou shalt put the 2 stones upon the shoulder pieces of the ephod, of the garment, to be stones of memorial for the children of Israel. And Aaron shall bear their names before the Lord upon his 2 shoulders for a memorial. And Aaron, in addition, shall bear the names of the children of Israel in their breastplace of judgment upon his heart, when he goes in unto the holy place for a memorial before the Lord continually. So my friends, if you can now imagine the attire of the high priests, the priest has 12 stones on the chest plate. That is now horizontal. People can look at them horizontally for other people to look at. And he has the 12 names of the tribes of Israel divided 6 by 6 on 2 shoulders, and that is vertical. Just a second, Ari, we lost the feed here. Yes. Okay, as it says on verse 12, and thou shalt put the 2 stones upon the shoulder pieces of the ephod, and Aaron shall bear their names before the Lord upon his 2 shoulders. So the attire of the Kohen Gadol already shows his functioning as axis mundi. You think of it literally as a cross. There are those on his shoulders to be seen by divinity, and then there are the stones on his chest to be seen by the other Israelites. And of course, the Kohen Gadol now negotiates that relationship between divinity and the Israelites, and this role becomes the most intimately induced in one moment, in one place, and that is at the Holy of Holies, in the temple, in Yom Kippur, where the Midrash actually tells us that on that holy day, the Kohen Gadol enters the temple with a golden rope that is 30 feet long attached to his robe, and it is stretched outside the Holy of Holies. So in case the Kohen Gadol has a blemish or an ethical blemish, he would fall dead on the spot because he entered the Holy of Holies. And this way the Israelites can pull him out without entering that place. A very dramatic notion of the priesthood and its role before God. That's number 3. Now let's continue. Number 4. Let's roll the page here. Yes, let's roll down the page. Yes.
Is it working?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
A little bit more, Ari, a little bit more.
I'm rolling. I don't know if it's just taking time for you to see it. So can you see it now?
Yes, good. The fourth axis mundi is the king. And here is an example for you from King Solomon, who inherits the temple, builds and inherits the first temple. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the princes and the fathers' houses of the children of Israel unto King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. And it came to pass, when the priests were come out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, which means divine providence and divine presence. You jumped a little bit. And it came to pass when the priests were come out of the holy place that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister by reason of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. It means it's such a dramatic moment that even the priests cannot be there. And the king turned his face about and blessed all the congregation of Israel, and all the congregation of Israel stood. Or in other words, the king himself, Solomon, faced the cloud, received that divine enlightenment, that divine providence, turned his face around now to give that grace and give that benevolence, or to become the conduit of this benevolence towards the people of Israel. So we have, so far, we had miracles, we had prophets, we had priests, we had kings, and now we come to the last one, which I had already mentioned to those of you who were with us last week, and that is the land itself. The land of Israel itself, if you remember, we talked about it as a covenantal land, and I'll repeat this very briefly for those who were not with us last week. The land of Israel itself is perceived as a Jewish land that is committed as an active member of the covenant between the people of Israel and the God of Israel. And I give you 3 examples which I've elaborated upon last week as well. It is the land that keeps the Sabbath through the what we know the laws of Shemitah. So here it says in Leviticus, and the Lord spoke unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, when you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath unto the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow your field, nor prune thy vineyard. And I mentioned to you last week that this year is a sabbatical year in Israel as well. And those of you who come to Israel can find in different places around the country fields that have big signs that say, we keep Shemitah, we keep the 7th year for this land. The second rite of passage, or the covenantal rite, is of circumcision, and we learn about it through the act of, through the word orla, circumcised or foreskin, where we learn that the tree, the fruit of the tree that is planted within Israel is rendered uncircumcised for 3 years, whereupon on the 4th year, it is given as a sacrifice to the temple, and on the 5th year, it can be eaten. And when you shall come into the land, you shall have planted all manner of trees for food. Then you shall count the fruit thereof as uncircumcised, or arelim in the original Hebrew. 3 years shall it be as uncircumcised unto you. It shall not be eaten. And then it goes on to continue. And the last one is, of course, the acts of tzedakah, which is the act of bringing the world and society into harmonious utility, which is the prime objective of prophets as well, to talk about tzedakah. And the land is expected to take an active role in tzedakah through laws such leket, pe'ah, shichecha, And when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corner of thy field, neither shall you gather the gleaning of thy harvest. You shall leave them for the poor, for the stranger, for the widow, for the destitute. And there are tens of laws like this throughout the Torah. I am the Lord your God. In other words, the land itself negotiates the relationship between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. And as we now continue, let's roll down. Now we face the destruction. And ladies and gentlemen, when we face the destruction of the temple, it is not only the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple was the final point or the final moment of a saga of destruction, that at the end of which the people of Israel were left with no more miracles, no more prophets, no more priests, definitely no more temple, no more kingship or kinghood, and no more land. They were expelled. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the entire structure of the biblical model, which relied on these negotiators of the covenantal relations between the God of Israel and the people of Israel within that land of Israel, were abolished. This is a moment of catalysmic transformation. It is not the destruction of a temple, but rather the destruction of a model, of a paradigm of living for Jews. So now we are faced with a reality when we have no more miracles, no more prophets, no more priests, no more temple, no more kings, and no more land. What is left? What is left? What is left is Torah. Torah, which actually told us the story of all of these axis mundis, now becomes the chief axis mundi. Torah cannot be destroyed. Words cannot be destroyed. Ideas cannot be destroyed. Values cannot be destroyed. However, after the destruction of the biblical model, Torah becomes the chief axis mundi, and that is why, ladies and gentlemen, that until this very day, if you look closely, in some synagogues, Torah scrolls until this very day are dressed as the high priest, are literally dressed as the high priest. They now they have a crown as a king. They have a chest plate as a high priest. They become the embodiment of the axis mundi. But if Torah is the chief arbitrator of the relationship between the God of Israel and the people of Israel, who is now poised to become the chief leader of a community or a Judaism at the precipice of crisis? The one who knows Torah, the one who can explicate Torah, the one who can negotiate Torah as a way back to God. Or in other words, the rabbi. And here, ladies and gentlemen, we move from the biblical paradigm to the rabbinic paradigm, to the rabbinic model. And here we see now an evolution where the rabbis assume responsibility and assume authority over Jewish life, but also they assume the power over Jewish life. Here we need to negotiate between the theological urgency, which is somewhat romantic, and the political realpolitik of rabbis on the ground who now understand that unless they assume this leadership and galvanize their authority within the Jewish community, Judaism might go extinct. And because of that negotiation of a romanticized view of the past and a very pragmatic view of the present, we now find the early rabbinic period as it manifested in the Mishnah and in other early texts, and later on in the Talmud, in a very interesting relationship with the biblical period or with the biblical model. On the one hand, a desire and a deep respect to that model of old, which was the very substance and the very root of Jewish life. And on the other hand, a very pragmatic understanding that this model no longer exists, and not only that it no longer exists, that the rabbis now need to introduce a new model and to legitimize it as part and parcel of Jewish evolution. So now look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah, just to put it in context, the Mishnah was composed during the late 3rd century. So we're talking about less than 2 centuries after the destruction of the temple. And the Mishnah now sees itself as the Torah shebe'al peh, the Torah by heart, which is now governed by rabbis. And look how the rabbis now in Tractate Avot now put forward their role in juxtaposition to the axis mundis of old. Greater is learning Torah than the priesthood and the royalty, they say. Remember, these are two types of axis mundis from the old paradigm. Greater is learning Torah than the priesthood and royalty. For royalty is acquired by 30 stages, and the priesthood by 24, and the Torah by 48. I won't get into now each one of those stages, just to show you how they now try to put the learning of Torah, and of course their role as the leaders of that process, above the prior axis mundi. In Seder Olam Rabbah, which is also an early text, we learn the following thing. Until now, the rabbis say, prophets were prophesying through the Holy Spirit, right? We learn. From now on, listen and heed the voice of the sages. Sages here is rabbis, of course. In other words, in the previous model, there was direct divine intervention that dealt with matters of life. From this point on now, from this new model, we are the ones, the rabbis, who negotiate this relationship with divinity. Here is a wonderful example from the Babylonian Talmud, the first of two that we'll see today, that shows you how the rabbis now further entrench themselves in their centrality in Jewish communal life as they see where this is going. Rabbi Abba said, this is from the Masechet Tractate Eruvin in the Babylonian Talmud, Again, if the Mishnah was composed during the 3rd, 4th century, the Babylonian Talmud was composed about 200 years later. Rabbi Abba said in the name of Rabbi Samuel, for 3 years, the rabbinic houses of Hillel and Shammai. Here, just so you know, the Talmud is speaking about the rabbis of the Mishnah. Okay, so now the Talmud is talking about the rabbis who preceded it by 200 years. For 3 years, the rabbinic houses of Hillel and Shammai disputed over matters of halakha. These say halakha is according to us, and these say halakha is according to us. A heavenly voice came forth. A heavenly voice, of course, is divine intervention, and said, both are the living words of God, and halakha is according to the house of Hillel. Now you will ask, each one who reads this, rightly so, will ask, okay, if both are living words of God, or in the Hebrew, elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim, if both are the living words of God, if both are right, why did God chose the house of Hillel? And now look at the answer that the rabbis give. It's not because they understand God better. It's not because they have people who have prophetic visions. It's not because they're descendants of kings or prophets or what have you. It's not because they have an ear to divinity none of that. Look at why was Hillel chosen? Why was the house of Hillel chosen? Because they were humble and pleasant and always teach the arguments of Shammai alongside their own. And even further, they always taught the arguments of Shammai before stating their own. In other words, what the rabbis are doing here now, they are rooting their authority in social discourse rather than divine sanction. It's a new model. It's a new model. And indeed, it is a brilliant move. If we scroll down a little bit again, we now get a testimony from the Mishnah itself about the house of Hillel and Shammai. And look what it says. Let's go. You scrolled a little bit too much. Yeah, look at the Mishnah here at the Duyot. These are the matters in which the house of Hillel changed its ruling in favor of the house of Shammai. Now, guys, you have to understand. And then the Mishnah continues to give 7 examples wherein Hillel decreed that halakha should be according to the house of Shammai. However, look at the rabbinic brilliance. We just saw that a divine voice decreed that halakha should always be according to Hillel. And here we see that Hillel actually changed its ruling in favor of the house of Shammai. So you may ask, wait a second, is Hillel actually, the house of Hillel, actually not doing what the divine voice said it should do? In other words, disobeying divinity? Not at all. Because if you think about it, if it is the house of Hillel that decided that halakha is according to Shammai, it means that halakha is according to Hillel. Because it is Hillel who decided that halakha is according to Shammai. So there's no disobedience here, but rather again, halakha based on human discourse, which becomes the very heart of the Talmudic mind frame. And now, to conclude this, we're going to look at one of the most dramatic midrashim in the Babylonian Talmud, which brings now the 2 models into war, into a clash between one another. And here the rabbis allegedly put the old model to rest and now completely galvanize their authority through this midrash. And this midrash is known as Achnai's oven. And if you know a little bit about Talmudic tractates, the way they're built, Usually they start with an event, with an episode, a question that needs to be deliberated upon, and then starts a whole argument around it. But if you're not an experienced Talmudic student, you may end up very easily forgetting the question that started the whole debate. But that is exactly the point. The question that brings about the debate is nothing more than a trigger, and the conclusions that come from that debate pertain to much larger issues. And this tractate is no different. The issue before us on this tractate is about an oven made of clay. And the question the rabbis ask themselves is, if a piece of clay was broken, are you allowed to fix it with a certain piece of clay? It's something that sounds ridiculous, but obviously not for them. Okay, but then we'll see where this argument goes, and you will see that it's a very, very, very dramatic evolution. It was taught, if one cut an oven into sections and places sand between every section, what is the ruling? Is it kosher? Is it not kosher? Rabbi Eliezer rules it pure, and the other rabbis, the other sages, rule it impure. Just to put things in context here for you guys, we are now joining the Sanhedrin, the High Court of Jewish law, the High Court of Rabbinic Jewish law, presides over this issue, 12 rabbis. Rabbi Eliezer is equivalent to the Chief Justice. This is a serious, serious authority. The authority on halachic matters at the time. So Rabbi Eliezer rules it kosher, pure. He says, yes, you can put sand between them and the oven will be kosher. All the other sages say, no, you're wrong, it is impure, and this is the tractate before us called Oven of Achnai. And now let's see what happens. It was taught, as they now argue, on that day, Rabbi Eliezer answered all the answers on earth, and they, the other rabbis, did not accept it from him. In other words, it says here, when it says Eliezer answered all the answers on earth, it means he used all the tools within his power, all the rabbinic tools within his power, all the interpretation possible, all the exegetical tools in his power to convince them that he's right, with his genius with his knowledge of text, his knowledge of Torah, but he failed. The other rabbis were not convinced. And then look what Rabbi Eliezer does. So Rabbi Eliezer said, if the law is like me, that is, if I'm correct here, the carob tree will prove it. What? The carob tree? The carob tree will prove it? And lo and behold, what happens? The carob tree that is outside the court was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some even say 400 cubits, and replanted itself in the ground. Now, what does Rabbi Eliezer do here, ladies and gentlemen? What does he introduce into the discussion now? A miracle. He introduces a miracle. And if you remember, a miracle was one of the axis mundis that was very legitimate in the old model, in the old paradigm. It was all over. As a matter of fact, it was a chief tool to show divine vindication and divine approval. But here, look what happens. The rabbis say to him, we do not bring proof from a carob tree. Whoa. So Eliezer looks and says, okay. So he comes back and says to them, if the law is like me, the water channel will prove it. The water channel flowed in reverse direction against gravity. Another miracle. And they again look at them unfazed and they say, sorry, we do not bring proof from a water channel. Do whatever you want. It's irrelevant to the discussion here. Rabbi Eliezer is relentless. He comes back and said, if the law is as I say, and by the way, he's getting angry too, the walls of the house of study will prove it. And now look what happens. The walls of the house of study incline to fall. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer is willing to put everybody in danger and have the walls collapse upon them if they don't accept his authority by way of miracles. And you see that the miracles actually happen. The walls of the house of study inclined to fall, upon which one of the rabbis, Rabbi Joshua, protested at the walls and says, if scholars argue with each other in the law, how does it affect you? Or in other words, why are you intervening in this? And look what happens. The walls did not fall because of the honor of Rabbi Joshua, but did not straighten in honor of Rabbi Eliezer, and still they incline and stand. In other words, my friends, now you have to imagine the house of study with two inclining falls butting heads against each other. We are having here two paradigms, two models of Judaism fighting one against the other. And now Rabbi Eliezer comes back and he takes out his final card. If the law is like me, he says now, from the heavens they will prove it. He had enough. If you don't accept even that, axis mundi, a miracle, I'm showing you a miracle. It is obvious that the big kahuna upstairs agrees with me, and you are disobedient to that, I'm going to let God tell you straight in your face that I'm right. And lo and behold, look at what happens here. A heavenly voice came out and said, what is with you towards Rabbi Eliezer? For the law is like him in every instance. My friends, this could not get more dramatic than this. A divine voice rebukes the rabbis and says to them, why do you continue arguing with Rabbi Eliezer, who's been proven right up to this point on every issue of halakha? I don't know about you, but if God came to me like this and said, Zohar, listen, stop arguing with Ari. He is right. He's always been right. I would get the hell out of there. Say, Ari, whatever you say, thank God, leave me alone. But this is not what the rabbis are doing. My friends, what is at stake in this tractate is the survival of a new model without which the rabbis believed Judaism will not be able to continue and flourish. And look at what happens now. After this divine voice comes out and rebukes the rabbis, the same Rabbi Joshua stood on his feet and he says the famous dictum, Lo bashamayim hi. It is not in the heaven. Now comes the big question. What did Rabbi Joshua actually do here? Did Rabbi Joshua actually tell God to, as it were, butt out, to stay out of the discussion, don't interfere? Do you think he was that audacious? Do you think the rabbis would even imagine to talk like that to divinity? Not at all. And that is not at all the purpose of what is happening here. What is happening here, my friend, is a brilliant move of the rabbis put in the mouth of Rabbi Joshua, who now actually takes a verse from the Torah itself, from God itself, from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19, where God says to Moses, the Torah is not in the heaven, and it is not across the ocean, but rather it is beficha ubelevavcha la'asoto. It is in your mouth, in your heart, and in your actions. So what does Rabbi Joshua actually do here? I'll give you a parable. Imagine that a young man or a woman who decides that they want to find the ultimate truth, and they sell all their belongings and they venture off to the Himalayas, where they hear that on top of one of those mountains in Nepal, there is an old sagacious woman who knows everything. And they venture off and they climb and they climb and they climb and they climb. And eventually they get to this sage woman and they bow before her and she says, "What do you want?" And they say, "I want to know the truth." And that woman looks at them now and says the following thing: "Listen to me. Don't listen to anyone but yourself." Now, if that person listens to her, he cannot listen to her. And if he does not listen to her, he already listened to her. In other words, what Rabbi Joshua did here, he actually says to God, "You said in the Torah, you yourself said, when you gave us the Torah, you said that the Torah is not in the heavens. You said it. So by not listening to you right now in this house of study, in this house, in this court of law, by not listening to you right now, I am listening to you. I am fulfilling your commandment not to listen to you anymore because you said it. So it's not that I'm banishing you from the discussion, but rather you never left to begin with. You are always present in the living words of the rabbis as they argue over Torah. By doing that, the rabbis try now to bring together the romantic desire to sustain the old model without losing their newly formed authority over a new model of Jewish life. They lament over the past, fully cognizant of the fact that they need to exercise power and authority over the present and the future. And indeed, this tractate, which continues in a very dramatic way with Rabbi Eliezer, the Chief Justice, the head of Sanhedrin, being boycotted, undergoing a cherem, which is one of the most dramatic punishments in rabbinic literature. But at the end of the tractate, Rabbi Natan, another member of the Sanhedrin, met the prophet Elijah, who, as you know, in our tradition, Prophet Elijah never died. He is in heaven, and once in a while he sojourns back from heaven to earth. So he met the prophet Elijah and said to him, "Tell me, what did the holy, bountiful one, Ribono Shel Olam, what did the Kadosh Baruch Hu, what did God do in that hour? What did God do when Rabbi Joshua leaped to his feet and said the Torah is not in the heaven to the divine voice?" And Rabbi Elijah says, he smiled, God smiled and said, "My children have defeated me. My children have defeated me." Or in other words, my children have won over. They now have a new model and I'm giving them my blessing. So by this way, the rabbis are now receiving the divine blessing for the new model. Once we understand the drama that took place in that transformative period between the biblical model and the rabbinic one can now truly understand that Tish'aa B'Av was not merely about the destruction of a temple on top of a mountain, as important as it is, but rather that the destruction of the temple is merely the front of a destruction of a model, of a momentous occasion in Jewish life, where the Jewish people and its new leadership realized that unless they're going to take a very dramatic turn from the old model, Judaism will not survive. And by putting that model as a place to mourn and to remember and to pray for, the rabbis were able to reconcile a genuine desire to relive days of old on the one hand, some sort of a messianic catharsis, a redemptive narrative for the future, while being very pragmatic and very politically savvy to understand that right now, for the time being, for as long as it takes, we, the rabbis, and the model that we build around the rabbinic institution are the ones who are given the authority, the responsibility, and the chance to lead the Jewish people in a new way. Tish'aa B'Av is remembering both past and future, and remembering a moment of great crisis, which had turned into a moment of great opportunity.
Thank you. Okay, we have a moment just for a little bit of a discussion. I'm going to start off with kind of my big question, which is, I grew up in the Orthodox world, davening 3 times a day, and many of us go to synagogue, and even in other services, you open the Siddur, which is written by the rabbis, and right there is a desire to go back to the exact model that is gone. Why would we ever want to go back, and should we go back to that old model? Because if we had that old model, I don't know if Judaism would even exist today, given where we are in the world. So the question is, do the rabbis really want to go back to that old model? Should we want to go back to that old model? Why do we pray to go back to that old model?
Okay, so there are a number of layers to this question. I'm definitely not any authority to say whether we should or not. What I can say, however, is that Judaism, when you look at the evolution of Judaism, you see a pattern that pretty much comes and says the following thing. Any generation that forgets its past forfeits the right to be remembered by its future. In other words, the notion of memory is a sacred value statement for Judaism. Irrespective of the pragmatic evolution of Jewish life, you are forever committed to remember from whence you came. In other words, remembering who you are is understanding that you are part of an ongoing journey. And just like you want to be remembered by your future, so should you remember your past. And really, there is no other theological constitution on earth that has sanctified memory to the extent that Judaism has. And indeed, remember in this case is a good word in the English, lizkor in Hebrew, lizkor in the Hebrew, but to remember in Judaism is not only to remember as a cognitive act, but also to remember, to become a member of those people who are remembering. It's also an act. You don't only apply memory, but you also commemorate. And the rabbis are very cognizant of that. Tish'aa B'Av is a rite of commemoration and not only a rite of memory. And commemorating something is putting memory into action, rendering it an integral part of who you are in the present. That's why it's so important. And that has nothing to do with the second part of your question, whether it should happen or not. Sometimes the power of an apocalypse is by the fact that it remains an apocalypse, and it allows you to explore your present in a more passionate form.
I think you answered part of the question. You answered why we remember, and I think that is the power of Judaism, and I think it's great. It's amazing our tradition. We remember people who've passed away. We remember our history. And I think that's what has kept us in many respects. But my question is a little harder or a little different in that if you open the prayer book, we are obligated. We are looking forward to the day where we return to the old model. We want to rebuild the temple. We want to bring back the sacrifices. And there are people who literally are trying to do that, as you know, in Israel. There's a group who like to, but
Right.
from a certain part of the Jewish world, and this doesn't speak maybe to the, if I'm talking about the Orthodox world, it seems like it is rebuilt, and the rabbis really built a concept of, well, we're here temporarily, and we're going to do what we want to do, but ultimately, no, we want to go back to that model. Seems to me not a great concept. I don't think many people want to go back to that model. So we remember it, right? I don't want to go back to Lithuania, but I want to remember my family's history. I don't want to go back to Poland, but I want to remember my family's history. But it seems like we do have this real strong traditional push to a return to this old model that was destroyed, and is probably not something that would work now.
What you are talking about is exactly the nature of rabbinic language in its early form, which needed to substantiate its power, but without intimidating or alienating its audience. Or in other words, to come and say, we are here at an interim stage until the old model returns to life. I want you to remember that when this happened, after the destruction of the Second Temple, when this happened, indeed, the Jews were introduced to a number of people who actually claimed that they are the inheritors of the old model, one of whom is very familiar to all of us because his name is Jesus. And Jesus was indeed a man who came and said, I am even higher than a prophet, even higher than a king. I am an accumulation of all of this. I am a word of God who comes to you to take you on this path at this moment of great crisis. And the rabbis, the early rabbis, came and said exactly the opposite. They say, no, the way back to God is not by God coming down to earth, it's but by humanity going back to God through Torah, through exegesis of Torah. In other words, there is two models here fighting each other, and eventually, 350 years later, parting ways completely in that regard. In that regard, Christianity comes from the up down, whereas Judaism now comes and says, no, the only way back to divinity is from the bottom up. It is a way of exegesis, Torah study, midrash, esoteric wisdom, the book of mysticism, whatever you want. All of this becomes the language, while we are completely committed to the old model. That's the romantic view. Whereas the pragmatic view is, until the Messiah comes, until this apocalypse realizes itself, until this happens, there is another way we should explore and another path that we should take, which is the rabbinic period until this very day.
And my understanding, and this came up by some questions, is that, I mean, the rabbis were active before the destruction of the temple. So there was a lot of politics going on. So it's not like the rabbis appeared out of nowhere after the destruction. This process had started in a certain way, and after the destruction, the rabbis were left in a certain way in a stronger position with regard to what they wanted to achieve, since the other avenues for Judaism had been destroyed. So I want to make sure that my understanding is correct. The rabbis were kind of already starting this discussion earlier in history, right?
The rabbis before, first of all, of course, there were rabbis, just like there were synagogues before the destruction of the Second Temple. There were synagogues. The rabbis at that point were just teachers of Torah. The word rabbi means moreh, the teacher. The transition or the transformation became when the rabbi became the default. By existential default, the rabbi now turned from a teacher to a leader of a nation, to the one who can exercise this kind of what I will call exegetical, interpretive cartography of the Torah, building a map back to God to understand the mind of God. But the whole way of doing it now is not through thunder, voice, booming voices from above who say go left and go right, but rather dialogue, discussion, negotiation, pilpul, disagreement, all of the tools that we became accustomed to. And at that point, were still very, very much a novelty, which needed to exercise its authority in the rabbinic period.
Ironically, it's probably true that we are still here because of the trauma that we suffered in the destruction. In other words, if not for the destruction of the temple, we may have stuck with a sacrificial cult and an approach that became ahistorical, uninteresting, and irrelevant. But the rabbis took us, because of history, on a different path, and that's why we're still here. That's
exactly why I said, when you look at Tish'aa B'Av from a contextualized standpoint, you give tears their place as an act of memory and respect, and you gain a new appreciation of your present and future. In other words, it's not just about crying, it's also about revisiting the Jewish history in a new light and a new form of appreciation. Absolutely.
And what you've been saying about a Christian Jesus model versus a rabbinic exegesis model reminds me of a T-shirt that Mark Michael Epstein wants to put into our CSP online store, and it says "Jews for exegesis." So we're going to make that T-shirt, and I think it's not my job.
You remind me of when I was a student at the University of Michigan. I once entered a store that showed Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche says God is dead, signed beneath Nietzsche, and beneath that it said Nietzsche is dead, signed God.
Another t-shirt idea for our store. By the way, I'm a Kohen, so technically if the Messiah does come and they reopen business, the barbecue business in Jerusalem, we're going to have a little problem because I'm also a vegetarian. So we got many challenges. Jeff Kaufman, I'll leave the last question to Jeff Kaufman, which is prophets. The old model that you showed us had prophets as part of it. Do we still have prophets now? Why can't we have prophets? Aren't our poets and our writers our prophets? Because the way you describe prophets, which is very beautiful, is certainly something that we can still have today. Whereas kings, we have an Israeli government with prime ministers who sometimes think they're kings. I understand that, but prophets is something maybe we could still have. Is that a fair request or statement?
Absolutely, and I actually believe very much in prophets according to the way I define prophets. I think that Martin Luther King Jr. was a prophet. I think that Isaiah Leibovich of Israel was a prophet. I think that there are people who have the insight to remain ethically and morally loyal and see a certain trajectory of humanity and have the courage to warn people from where they're going and have prophetic moments. In that respect, I think that our entire view of the prophets of Israel should also change from a religious perception or a spiritual perception to a perception of a heightened sense of moral, ethical, and social justice. I think that a prophet is a person who is perpetually agonized by injustice wherever he sees it. I think Abraham Joshua Heschel had prophetic moments. I think that Al Gore had prophetic moments on certain issues. Again, you don't have to be a prophet all the time or a prophet now. You can have prophetic moments in life, and I believe that some people can attain such prophetic moments. And I'll say even more than that. I think that every human being has prophetic moments regarding themselves, but unfortunately, we're very good at ignoring them most of the time. But that's a different issue.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for part 2 of our series. And can you tell us a little bit more about what we talk about next week when we wrap up our first 3-part masterclass with you?
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody. Chag Chanukah Sameach. And it's wonderful to be with all of you. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of you, or Bezrat Hashem, all of you next week.
So what will we be
Laila
doing?
Tov.
What will we be doing next week before you go? Tell us about the
Next
last
week
class.
we're going to talk. Next week we're going to talk about Jewish education in the 21st century, challenges and assets, where I'm going to outline some of the greater challenges that we face today in education in general and Jewish education in particular, and some of the possible conceptual philosophical responses to those challenges, also through my work at Birthright Israel and lecturing all over the world on these issues. I'm going to talk about this, by the way, next week, not next week, just after I meet with you, 2 days after I meet with you, I'm going to talk about this very lecture, but in different language, in the United Nations.
Nice. Well, we look forward to hearing about that. We wish you a safe trip back here to the United States, to New York. Wishing everybody a Chag Sameach for Thanksgiving. Is it Chag Hodu Sameach? How do we say that in Hebrew? I don't know.
Hodu la'Adonai ki tov.
Hodu l'Adonai ki tov. And yes, get your menorahs out. Make sure you got the candles. Take care, everybody. We'll see you on Sunday.
Toda rabba,
When we go
everyone.
on our teal.
Laila tov.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Bye-bye.